I'm preaching to the choir this morning. Hello, everybody. Y'all have all been through this with me, so we can reminisce together. And I'm really not seeing anyone who doesn't know who I am or how long I was here or anything. But some of you may have forgotten, so.
Chance of that.
Well, you may have forgotten some of the dates and things, right? So let's go ahead and have a prayer and then we'll get started. We do thank you, oh God, for this congregation and for the anniversary celebrations. We thank you for the movement of the Spirit within this congregation, both in the past, the present, and the future. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so I'm Neil Dunnavant, and I was working here from the summer of 2003 until March of 2022. So believe it or not, in 1 month I will have been retired for 3 years, which is kind of hard to believe. But came in the summer of 2003, the same summer that Dolly Jacobs came, and we had many great years together. And then I came as the pastor for outreach. Let me see if I can see fine without my and then in 2009, I was appointed the executive pastor, which was a new position for the congregation. And I would say the easiest way to explain that is that I took care of some of Sid's administrative responsibilities, particularly sort of head of staff issues involving the HR committee and just generally overseeing the staff so that he would have more time to do the preaching and teaching that he really had a passion for and felt called to do. So Sid came in 2001, so he had only been here about 2 years more, and I think when he first came in 2001, there was a big staff. There was some staff that maybe weren't very good fits. He had a lot of turmoil with that. I think a lot of just difficulties, and just found that taking care of the staff and doing the high-level administration was really soaking up a whole lot of his time. And so he soldiered on until 2009, and then asked me if I would help him with that, which I was very, very happy to do. I know the title is, well, it just says Sid Bats, yeah. So I was told when I signed up for this that it was just to be about the years I was here and to share some interesting things about some interesting challenges that the church faced in my years and how the staff and the congregation dealt with them. So I'm going to cover some hopefully interesting things. And as you know, mostly bad things are more interesting. So we have a fair number of bad things or difficult things, challenging things, because they're just more interesting than things that were easy or went very smoothly. Sid was a wonderful, wonderful person to work with. I never had any problems. He treated me so respectfully as a colleague. We're 3 years difference in age, so we both went to Princeton Theological Seminary. We didn't know each other. He left the year that I came, so I'm 68 now, so he's 3 years older, and he's been retired since 2018. But I have a lot of respect and a lot of just love for him and appreciate everything he did for me. Okay, so let me tell you, and everybody, I think probably, if not everybody, pretty much everybody here went through this with me, and you may remember some details that I have forgotten. But the first big problem that we dealt with, and it was a doozy, was that about the Life Center. So the Life Center was built in the late 90s. And in the winter of 2002, there was evidently, I was not here yet, but there was a heavy ice storm that put a lot of extra weight on the roof of the Life Center. And there were cracks started appearing and people started getting worried. And so they hired this company, Sutton Kennerly, who was also the engineering firm for the whole capital campaign renovations. And they began to inspect the building to see what happened. And it turned out that the company, that the main contractor, really did the church dirty and didn't build the thing right. I think the thing that strikes, I don't remember the name of the company, but sadly, by the time we found out about this, I think they were out of business and really weren't able to pay us anything in damages. But the thing that I remember the most was that when they inspected the load-bearing columns, they found construction trash inside the columns. So they were putting like old paint cans and brushes and junk like that. Yeah, this was before you, Jackie, so I'm sorry I'm sorry everybody has to relive this, but anyway, and I'm not going to dwell on it too long. And I'm going to say something positive in the end of it. Okay? So we're going to try to keep it light and positive. So there were some mistakes made that the church made too. The story I heard was that there were some members, particularly perhaps some retired members, who were construction people who were just hanging around watching, and they were telling whoever they was that we're seeing some problems. And evidently these Mo Sellers was one of them, I remember very well, who was telling people, evidently he was raising the red flags, and I don't know who wasn't listening or who should have been and wasn't, but evidently it wasn't taken seriously. There was also an architectural firm, I believe, Mother Mayor Phoenix, that was supposed to have been supervising the construction, and evidently didn't do a very good job because they didn't catch these things either. So I think the church was paying them a big amount of money to supervise it. And then the last thing I recall that the church's mistake was that there was some kind of a construction bond or a construction insurance policy that the church was supposed to take out. It was kind of a no-brainer, and for some reason the church didn't take it out. So.
Well, the specifics of that.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, because I figured somebody was. But yeah, without going into too many.
Right, having a little session as a mediator and as a judge, and we had a construction team advising and supervising the aftermath. But as we were told, the contractor represented to us that they had gotten a full construction bond, as they are required to do as licensed contractors. Well, they did. So it was on them. Now, we are not entirely with clean hands in the supervisory process, either, as Neil was alluding.
Yeah.
But that gave everybody room when it came to the resolution of that. Neil, you're going to get to that.
Okay, construction bond.
Yeah.
It's called a performance bond.
There you go.
Performance bond, okay, thank you. Yeah.
My recollection is that when there were people like Mo and others who were observing things that were going on, that we were instructed as members of the session and the congregation to not interfere. And so consequently, that knowledge was just, not respected.
Okay.
Clay Welker.
Clay Welker, yes, God bless him, yes. Okay, so I always thought that even though it would be a downer, that the whole thing about the Life Center would make an interesting PhD thesis for somebody, because there was just a lot of interesting things going on. There was a lot of moving parts. There were a lot of mistakes the church made. There were terrible things that this company in particular did to us, and so forth. I believe, and if I recall correctly, and Erwin will remember probably the exact amount, but there was, I think, some payoff from the architectural firm that helped us out somewhat. Do you remember that? Yeah.
And their insurance.
About $250,000, I think.
Okay, all right, so that was good. I think it cost $5 million to fix the problems. That's what I recall. Anybody? I think that's about right. Sounds about right. Okay, so I think here's what Sid. This is once again, it's been a few years, but this is what I recall that he did well and the church did well, and y'all can be proud that you handled well. So I think Sid was always really good, and he taught me to, let's find the right people who have the right attitudes about this, who maybe aren't gonna grumble and just say, well, I'm not gonna put any money into fixing this because the church messed up and we shouldn't have done anything. Let's find people with positive attitudes. Let's find people who will help us raise the money. And they did. And being new here, I was surprised because I was thinking there were going to be, and I guess there were people who were angry or disappointed. But what I remember overall was just how impressed spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, the church handled it. Because it could have just been a very divisive thing. And instead it was like, all right, we're human, we make mistakes, let's get this fixed. The Life Center is still important to us, we still need it. And it's a shame that we've had to spend $5 million more, but let's get it done. That's how I recall it. Anybody? Yeah, of course, yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Ben. I'll get to you, Ben.
This is really probably more a question about you.
Okay,
I came in as clerk of session with Sid.
okay.
And one of the things I was thinking with was, oh my gosh, you all went to seminary, and it seems to me that you're a construction manager and you're a architect and you're all this. Do they prepare you in seminary for not just the religious part, but like you're running a big place if that's the choice you go down? Is there some sort of how to deal with this kind of stuff?
Okay. This was actually one of Sid's big, things that he wanted to see improved. And he actually at some point got on the board at the seminary in Atlanta. And tried to get more, I think what he was mostly interested in was an improvement in leadership. It looks like we're running out of some chairs, but there may be, there's 2 seats up here in front, and I think that David's gonna help get some more. Now, most seminaries still have some classes in church administration, but you're not required to take them. And I would say that, as best I can tell, so here I am, 68, it's been a long time since I've been in seminary. I've never been on the board of the seminary faculty, at the seminary board or anything like that. But it still seems like the church is not dealing with it realistically. And they're still thinking that the most important thing is to train their pastors to be good preachers, theologians, teachers, expositors of the faith, make sure their theology is correct. And you just kind of have to figure it out on your own or have a knack for it, unless you're lucky enough to have been in another profession and learned it and then gone into that. So, I mean, I just had to, I didn't have any classes in administration. For a while there, when I was appointed executive pastor, I thought about taking some classes, but there was enough learning from the School of Hard Knocks. I think I just decided to go that route, and it seemed to work out pretty well, I guess. Okay, let me ask Betty.
I was on the session right when Sid came. That was my first term on the session. And you're talking about being positive. I'm sure there's people in here that were on that session. And we had our session meeting over in the Life Center with the wall torn open and all of the junk that was in there for all of us to see and hands-on. And being a teacher, hands-on is the way to go.
And Neil, again, not to take away from your presentation, Sid, but could you share with us just a little bit? You were a senior pastor up in Virginia, and what that was like for you, and then transitioning here, just as Sid came from a smaller church to a bigger one as well.
Well, not really a senior pastor. I was just a solo pastor. So I said, when I got here, I was serving, I had served in a large church when I was in seminary at the Nassau Presbyterian Church in Princeton. So I knew about multi-staff churches, but then after that, I really kind of thought that my niche was going to be solo pastor. I love to preach too, and when you're solo pastor, you end up preaching like 40-something sermons a year, so I had a lot of sermons that I had to figure out what to do with when I retired. And so, I mean, so I was in Fincastle, Virginia, in a small town, kind of a suburb of Roanoke now for 11 years, serving a small church of 200 members and another church of 80 members. And I show up here and I think I would never serve in a church that had a parking garage, you know. I mean, it was really quite and it was a big change for me. And but I also had gone to high school here in Greensboro. Greensboro is Kate's hometown. I knew a lot of people in Greensboro, and I was running into people that I had gone to school with in Grimsley and had always loved Greensboro, so there was no transitioning with that. I think after a while, you just kind of get used to it. But I think even with the leadership that Sid was talking about, it really wasn't like management, corporate management. You know, it's not the same thing. It's more like being visionary and maybe learning how to put together strategies and things like that, which is different from putting out fires and handling things. Okay, so I think that's probably enough on that. But let me just say something else that wasn't in my notes that came to mind that I'm also so proud of this church for. So at some other point, through Sharon Sumner's great leadership, we decided to start feeding the hungry. And I think my first thought was, how are the members going to feel about hungry homeless people coming to our campus? And particularly, how is the weekday preschool parents going to feel about seeing people lining up? And there was hardly any complaints at all. I mean, everybody was so really proud to have it. And I think the reason Hot Dish has worked so well is because we have it here at the church. I've always said that I thought that if we had it in some building in some other neighborhood that seemed to be maybe more convenient for the people who needed the meals, our members wouldn't have been quite as enthusiastic about it for various reasons. So anyway, I'm just putting that in. That's been going on all these years, and all these members have been so great about going out and doing this work and raising the money for us. It's just fantastic, guys. It's amazing. All right, so the next big problem we had, and Newton got caught up in this one too, and that was terrible, was the 2008 crash. And so one of the things you have to understand is that a lot of at least at that point, and I think today, a lot of people's giving is connected to their investment income. So it's not necessarily stock transfers. Some people give stock, appreciated stocks and things, but a lot of people, I think, maybe they could give $3,000 a year out of their salary savings, but if they have some stock dividends, or maybe they just have some other, you know, if they're older and they have an IRA, they have to pull out and they have to pull money out of every year, they're going to give more generously. Maybe they'll give $5,000 or $10,000 a year. So when the crash hit, a lot of our members were their portfolios, their life savings, so to speak, had really been hit hard. And the truth of the matter is that the church faced in the winter of 2009 about a $500,000 deficit. You know, and here I was, this was my first year as executive pastor, and I was like, oh my gosh. And Dave Maynard was the chair of HR, and he helped me. I don't know if we handled it the right way or not. I mean, at the time, we did the best we could. The strategy we came up with was for each department head, was given a number by us, like Christian education has to cut $150,000, music has to cut, you know, depending on what ratio theirs was, and then they would come up with a plan that they would present to the HR committee and see about it. And the problem was that we had to lay off some staff, and we also had to offer some people part-time employment that were getting full-time employment, and some people couldn't afford to do that, and they had to move on. It was a terrible, terrible time and very painful. But that was really just kind of the beginning stage, because once again, also in a church like this, despite all of the building costs, the biggest cost in the budget is going to be the staff salaries and benefits. I mean, that's just always gonna be, that's true in small churches too, probably even more so. I mean, when I was in Pentecostal, sometimes I felt bad about it because it seemed like my salary and benefits was 80% of the church's budget. You know, it wasn't a big budget, but they didn't need that much money to do the CE program. It was a small congregation. But it's not 80% here, but it's a lot. So, so that went through, that didn't go well. It caused a lot of morale problems. It was disappointing to our members. It was heartbreaking to some of the people who lost their jobs. But I would say this, that one thing good that came from the crash that's not necessarily about the church staff, and I'll get to that in a little more about that, is that I remember we had this big sort of meeting where we decided that this was a global crash. Remember, I mean, there were banks in Iceland that were failing and stuff. It was happening everywhere. And we had this big meeting, I think it was in the Virginia Gilmer room with the session and some of the leaders, like, what could we initiate to try to help people through this crisis? And the one really good idea that came from it that ended up, ironically and wonderfully, not costing the church any money at all, was the FPC jobs program. And some of you may remember that Bill Linton, Dick Bruce, both of them are no longer with us, and Jeff Claypool, who's I think still very much alive, but is not a member of our congregation anymore. The three of them got together and decided to form a job, what would you call it? Just support. So they would give people help on their resumes. They would do networking. They would ask them to do their elevator speech, those kind of things. David Hammer came to it many times to give his expertise, and others of you, I'm sure, volunteered and helped. And that went on for quite a long time. And it didn't help a whole lot of our members necessarily, but a lot of the middle class kind of white collar, whatever you want to call it, middle class, office oriented people came here to the church a couple of days a week and got a lot of support. And I'm very proud of that organization. I was very involved in helping them with that too. But here was the biggest thing, and this was a lot of what I ended up having to deal with, was the truth of the matter is that, this is my opinion perhaps, is that by the 08-09 crash, the church was probably overspending anyway. And so we had a lot of staff. At one point we had the newsletter was coming out weekly. So we had to have a big staff to take care of that. We had a full-time daycare center that was oriented more on the basement of the Life Center. It ended up, we lost tons of money on it every year, and it caused lots of headaches because of regulations about taking care of children and all. Now, I'm not talking about the weekday preschool, which is a part-day program. I'm talking about a full-on daycare center. And so we had to shut that down eventually. And you can imagine how many parents were upset about that. I mean, all of them were, of course. But there was just a lot that we had a full kitchen staff. And I remember once a week, all of the staff, which included all the teachers at the weekday preschool, the teachers at the daycare center, and all of the rest of the staff, got a free lunch on Wednesdays, and the staff fixed it. And these were just all expenses. You know, even just a big staff goes on a retreat for a weekend. It costs thousands and thousands of dollars. And so I think that was really hard on Sid, because he kind of, and if he were here, I'm not saying anything I wouldn't say if he were sitting here. I just feel like that felt like a failure to him, that we would have to downsize a little bit or be a little more thrifty. And that was kind of my unpleasant role, was to help the church see that we just don't have the money anymore, and maybe some of it really doesn't need to be spent anyway. I mean, we ended up for instance, just about every head had a full-time administrative assistant. I had a full-time administrative assistant for a while, and a wonderful woman who I had deep regard for and worked well with, but I could tell that I really didn't have enough work for her to do for the whole day, you know, and so we had to, and so then Debbie Foster, God bless her, she ended up absorbing like 3 or 4 other people's jobs. And so we went from having 4 full-time assistants to 1 or a part-time, or Donna had to switch to part-time instead of full-time. The newsletter went from once a week to once a month to quarterly. I mean, you know, it was all those kind of things. Just, it was one thing after the other. There were, and still are, some major challenges that I don't want to go into in detail, but they're just, these buildings were not set up for efficient use. Like in the memorial building, I don't know if they fixed it by now, but it used to be that if you had the air conditioning on, it had to be on the whole building, or the heat the same way, the same with the Shepherd building. And so there was not a very much zone heating or zone cooling. The Shepherd building had turned about, Sid never liked the Shepherd building, and so he really was focused on getting us out of the Shepherd building. And it's still been a challenge. I guess the staff, some of us liked it and some of us didn't. I know Nancy had a fabulous library over there that was so much bigger and better than what she ended up having to downsize to a lot, to something that's very different from what it was before. So there were losses like that. But on the other hand, I guess the staff felt we were closer to the sanctuary. So that's getting me into, well, let me just back up a little bit. I think one of the hardest things that I had to learn through this experience was that it's very difficult. Somebody much wiser than me had pointed out that in the church culture, maybe this is true in business too, it's much easier to start a program than it is to stop a program, right? Oh my gosh. And so you have to be very careful about what you start, because if some people like it and you decide, you know, this is really not working, there's only 4 people coming, we were expecting 100, and those 4 people are not going to be happy because you took away this program that they really like. Or it just feels like a failure. You know, some of the women's circles, I remember there was was it called, what was the professional women's circle that met at night instead of the day? Bethany. I went through that with them, and it was so painful because they were so proud of their heritage, and it got to the point where it just wasn't working for them anymore, and it was time to stop. And you know, one of the things that David Partington used to say to all of us to help us is that could we just get to the point where we could celebrate what did happen instead of mourning the loss of it, right? I think the Wednesday night suppers, very similar things. We would think about the glory days, about how many people used to come, and then the people that still want to come, and then the kitchen closes, and I mean, you know, it's just so, yeah, and I think when you're cutting programs and staff, the other thing you really have to deal with, and I think Sid struggled mightily with this, was you don't want that, we always were talking about, we don't want to look like a sinking ship. Sinking ship. And so the way to avoid that is you have to do things maybe a little bit slower than is the most prudent. Though sometimes maybe it didn't seem like it was slow, but people have to adjust to it. And there's just a lot of peculiarities in churches that may not be exactly the same as in businesses. I'm not going to throw this in too. This was not in my prepared notes, but it just occurred to me. I think in Sid's tenure, 2001 to 2018, this was the most challenging thing he had to deal with. Was not any of the things I've talked about. It was moving the 11:15 service to 10 o'clock. Okay, and I don't mean to disparage the members, because you know I love you all, and I have high regard for all of you, but that was so hard on Sid, and I didn't catch it as the associate pastor. That was one time I was very glad to have not been the senior pastor, and that wasn't fair either, because Sid caught all of it. And it just, people didn't like having to change. It was almost like the Goldilocks, well, 10 o'clock is too early and so, but his reasoning was sound. And the reasoning is that we had a 9 o'clock and an 11:15. And the 9 o'clock had the dynamism and the energy, and the 11:15 didn't. And most visitors came to the 11:15 because that was the same. See, the visitors come, they see the church looks not very full. It looks kind of older instead of younger. They don't see very many children, and they don't come back. And so I think we just went to one service at 10, didn't we? Is that what happened?
10:30. 10:30.
Was it 10:30? Okay. Well, see, that's only 45 minutes. Okay. Ginger, help me out here.
Now, one of the techniques that Sid used, very Presbyterian, was create a committee.
Yeah.
But in the private sector, when you decide about cutting this or cutting that, you make a management decision and you do it. One of the advantages about having a committee, and this was a time of service committee, whatever, we generated 75 pages of paper. But it begins to develop a little bit of a consensus among members of the congregation to support, I won't say deflect, but it's less of a unilateral decision. And Sid used that technique a lot
Yes, he did.
when things were hard,
Yes.
and at least it gave some built-in support for changes.
Yes, excellent point. And I should have had that on my notes. And that helped. And we have such great people here. And so everybody was always just fantastic at that. Okay, so I had chosen 3 things, was the Life Center, the OA crash, and then the last thing, which was mostly very positive, was the big capital campaign. And I don't really, do you remember, Bob, exactly when it started? Does anybody remember when it started? I can't. 2012, okay, thank you, Becky.
Through 2016.
So the economy had gotten a little bit better. And that was an interesting experience for me because I had never been a part of a big capital campaign. I think the goal had been at first $30 million, we thought, and we were going to do some really innovative things, and an architectural firm was hired and so forth. And then it came down to 15 million. And I think in the end, because of some problems discovered in the sanctuary, it was in the end about $17.5 million that we had to raise. And so there was, the strategy was really interesting and good. We had 2 big committees. This is how I recall. Once again, correct me if I've forgotten something. We had a group raising the money, and then we had a really big, fantastic group that was overseeing the construction. And they were learning from the problems of the Life Center. They created all these protocols. I don't know, was anybody on that construction committee by any chance? So, but anyway, they did such a great job. And by then, Tim Millizer, our property guy, was here, and he supervised that group and was, I think, did a good job. Now, just to remind some of you who weren't here during that time. So we got a big campus. The goal, the main goal was to do some major work in the sanctuary and completely renovate the Smith building, the big building that's connected to the sanctuary, the oldest building. Nothing really was done to Memorial, which is where the chapel is, or Coral, which is where the weekday preschool is. So those buildings have remained needing millions of dollars of renovation. So the things that would be most noticeable were all of the stained glass windows were beautifully clean. The ceiling with all the painting was cleaned and refurbished. And don't you remember when you first went in there, how much more light was pouring into the sanctuary? Because the windows had a lot of gum and goo on them that we didn't realize. And so some of the, I think there was carpeting, the new carpeting was replaced. Some of the pews were taken out. Not as many people coming to worship, didn't need as many pews. Most people were fine about that, more room, a little more roomy, we left a lot of more room out down front for things like setting up for music and so forth. And it had, probably the most amazing thing that had to happen was the entire organ had to be taken out so that it wouldn't have all this construction trash, dust and so forth. And the entire organ, not just the console, but all the pipes in the back and the front, all had to be taken out and put in storage somewhere, safe. And so they created offices, and I got moved from my office and Sid's office, and all the different offices were moved. And then Susan Petty Harmon, I believe is her name, she gave a really big gift so that we could build the solarium. And that was built, and then Nancy had to deal with how am I going to downsize the library. And I spent many hours helping Nancy figure out which books we could keep and which ones we might not need anymore. And we went through some of that, and Nancy had to make a lot of hard decisions on that. But we got through that, and that was a good positive thing. And I think the biggest challenge was, in the end, I think there was some asbestos found in some of the columns maybe, and then we needed a couple more $1 million, and it was just really, really tough. Let me see if, what else I had. Couple other thoughts. Another big challenges was, of course, Dolly Jacobs' death. That was just so hard for all of us. It was July the 29th, 2021. She had just turned 49 years old. We still don't know really what happened, but they think she probably had some kind of a blood clot. Her legs were susceptible to blood clots. I mentioned hot dish is a great thing. And the other thing that probably is more recently that none of us still want to talk about is the COVID lockdown. You know, and I've mentioned that to Kate, but nobody wants to relive that. I just mentioned it. Okay? But I will say there were people like John Atkinson who stepped up and said, look, this is a new era. We've got to look good on camera. And he helped us with that, and his son, and people came in, and because there was one thing that was difficult, I think, for this leadership and the members, was that when the lockdown first started, we were all in a position where we couldn't come to our church, but we could watch church just about anywhere in the world, couldn't we, with the internet? And so people were watching, and they were saying, I watch ours, and it just looks kind of old and doesn't look very interesting and bright. And I'm looking at this other church, and they've got better lighting, they've got better cameras, and we got to do something because people are going to just decide they might just start watching another church. Now, I think you could do a whole the COVID thing has changed a lot of things, and I'm not prepared to go into that in detail. I wasn't really even meditating on that as I was preparing to talk to you all today. But that has had a profound effect on the church worldwide, probably. Yes, Irvin.
Well, one other positive thing I think was the creation of the Rejoice service.
Yes. Okay, and what I can mention about that, if we connect with Sid and his ministry, I think when Sid first came, he was a traditionalist. He didn't really like what he had seen as contemporary worship. Interestingly, a lot of our pastoral residents, and Newton, I'll be interested to see if you have been in agreement with me on this. Most of our pastoral residents, not all of them, who've come out of seminary, have preferred traditional worship and haven't had a lot of deep interest in. Yeah, and so I think a lot of them were saying to us, here are these young people in their 20s saying, don't think just because I'm in my 20s that I want to rejoice. I prefer the sanctuary. You know, so there was that going on as well. Yes, Jack.
One of the things that I'm surprised is not on your list of challenges was the issue of ordination of gays and lesbians during,
Yes.
term.
Yes, I thought about bringing that one up too, but I mean, that has been a challenge my entire career. From my ordination in 1983, and I am pretty weary about it, but it's still an important issue, of course. And it has been a challenge. So if we move away from COVID, there were some good things that happened from COVID too, because people who are sick or can't come can watch, and it's easier to watch now if you have to miss. And I think there were some good things. Jill came shortly after. I was surprised when I was thinking through my days that I had about 3 years, there were about 3 years and 4 months that I continued after Sid had left. So he left in October of 18, and I left in March of 2022. So that issue. Okay, so here was another, and I think I'll stop with that, and then maybe I'll have some questions or comments. This was also hugely challenging, if I can go ahead and follow Jack's thoughts about this. I think the staff did a good job of trying to have a forum of conversation. I will have to remind you, at the time, the issue was not about the ordination of gay people or different kinds of sexual orientation. It was not about whether they could be members or whether they were loved by Jesus Christ. It was only really one issue, and that was whether the church was going to allow same-sex unions on campus. Okay, that was very specific. So it wasn't about me going to some, country club or park or to the beach or something and doing a service for a couple. It was about having a same-sex union in the sanctuary, the chapel, wherever. And that was what the debate was about. And so the way we did it was we had, I think all the pastors gave sort of a personal testimony about their issues, not just about that subject, but about sexual orientation in general, leave it at that. And then there were studies, we had studies, I may be forgetting a lot of the details, but once again, to Ginger's point, Sid was good about, let's get a process, let's put together a team, we're gonna put together a process, we're gonna do this, and this.
And there were home meetings too.
Home meetings,
Listening session.
listening sessions.
Yes, articles.
But I think what I learned from it was, and I don't mean to sound cynical about it, but the people who, so in the end, the session voted to approve it. I don't know to this day if there's ever been a same-sex union. Has there been, to your knowledge? No. Now, I've never personally been asked to preside at one in any place so far. I would be open to doing it if I am, but I have not been asked. But anyway, the people who were not in agreement with the decision, it wasn't unanimous as I recall, but it was a good majority. They still said to me the same thing, that they didn't feel heard. So what I had to learn from that was that people in disagreement, even if you're careful and go through everything, if you make a decision that's not what they believe in, they're still not satisfied. So there's really no way you can win on it. That's why I said, I don't mean to sound cynical, but it was a little disappointing. Did you want to say something?
I wanted to say that the vote was 44-10, so it was not it was not a cliffhanger.
Right.
And the fact that the issue presented was the narrow issue of whether a member of First Presbyterian Church who happened to have a different lifestyle could be married in our sanctuary.
Right, I mentioned that.
And preparatory to the actual vote, Sid scheduled time in the session meetings for 4, 5, maybe 6 months to talk about this each month. and to break into the groups and so forth. So it was not something that was kind of dropped in
Right,
and the pulse was taken,
right.
you know,
We had a lot of, Sid had a lot of respect for process and patience. He was so much better at that than I am. I don't know if I would have the patience going on and on, but you know, that was a good process. And I think in the end, maybe it was good. Okay, so I know it's time to go. The last thing I just want to say is I had a really great experience in my years. And I know it was difficult, but you people are amazing. Whenever people say, oh, I've heard it so hard on pastoral, I say, I had great experience. Even on the HR things, we had people like Hammer and others who were here for us, and I've had Jane Brabham. I mean, my gosh, she helped me out so much too with the HR. We always had excellent people on HR. We had great people, the finest people I've ever known and been privileged to be with. So, you know, that's my final thought. And so if you think about all those other things, just remember, that's my final thought. Any last words for the group before we bid? Yes, David.
Have you by any chance talked to Sid in the last little bit and gotten his kind of perspective on his time here and what he thinks about it? I'd be curious.
I would too. I have not done that.
Yeah.
Maybe we should invite him to come back.
Yeah.
Same thing. Let him talk about the things he wants to talk about.
It was, and looking at the arc of his ministry, you know, he was here for the celebration that Sherry and everybody put for the 200, and we had a good chat then. But as he was leaving, after he announced, you know, I and a few other folks went to him. I said, look, I know you're still looking forward and not backward, but I think we need to start thinking about a greatest hits compendium of your sermons. And that was the origin of what we did with Go and Do that became that great compendium of his 17 years. You talked about all the sermons. In many ways, you and he and Dolly are all still with us. And that is your legacy and that is his, because of what he started with in 2001, the challenges he had, what he left his church with, the challenges that confronted you and Danny, and then Jill as she came in. We are all so grateful for your pastoral leadership and for his.
Oh, thank you.